Okay, we're at the bottom of the hour. Welcome everyone to the Resource Advisor Cohort. We have a great lineup today. We're going to talk about fire retardant. We have an interagency panel, representatives from the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service are all here. Before I introduce them, we have some announcements and some training that we're going to talk about. And then I'll introduce the panel. And when we get through the presentations, when we start to do the presentations, if you guys can hold your retardant questions to last, that way they can get through. There's a lot of information to cover. This most likely will go over the typical READ cohort time. So, but we will have plenty of time for questions. And you'll have these people's contact information if you have any questions that you want to email them directly. So with that, I'm going to start with Pete. Pete, you have some announcements?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Jen. Hey, reiterate what Jen said. We're thinking we might go as much as 90 minutes today. So, tried to put that out to y'all so you knew it in the MailChimp announcement. If you need to drop off, of course, we will be posting this on the READCohort YouTube channel. That posting will likely be delayed because our YouTube expert and Chief Wrangler Lynn is out of the country, and one of her many tasks is editing our sessions for YouTube. I'm not sure if he's on or not, but want to give a shout out and congratulations to one of the cohort co-managers, Tom DeMayo, on his retirement from the Forest Service out there in Portland, Oregon. Tom is still active in the resource advising arena. And if you scroll to the bottom of the MailChimp email, he has a new personal email if you want to get a hold of him. Lots of good info in that MailChimp announcement. I'll just highlight a couple things. If you haven't heard about it yet, there is a new program called the Wildland Fire Therapy Service that is part of the Interagency Wildland Fire Health and Safety Initiative, and it is open to agency employees with at least a finger in wildland fire. And to introduce it, they're having a drop-in virtual introduction. They've had a couple of those sessions already. They're doing another one on February 10th. Starts out with a little overview and well worth the time. It's an amazing resource.
Okay.
All right, a couple more. As Jess may mention when she comes on, REEF, Fireline Resource Advisor, is now a full NWCG position, meaning that it is listed in the PMS 310-1 position handbook and has standardized qualifications, training, and recognition by all the NWCG agencies. Huge step, a lot of work by a lot of people. The other three...
Pete, you're coming in real choppy.
Hey, Jason.
Okay. Jen, am I choppy for you as well?
No, there's some background noise that I was trying to curb it. But you're good to go, Pete.
Okay, thanks. The other three resource advising positions, READ, REAC, and ARC, are still in the position supplement. They are not changed over to the position handbook. There's some minutia about what that means we won't get into now. Another big thing, N9042 is no longer the resource advisor training for any of the READ related positions. It has been replaced by M280. I think Jess is going to talk about the lead READ class, and I will just add on to that one of the prerequisites, I think, for that class, or one of the additional requirements, is to take I-300 and I-400. If you haven't taken those yet, there are several virtual deliveries of those sessions scheduled over the next few months, and I'll put some info in the chat about how to find out more about those. End of report, Jen.
Great. Thanks, Pete. And we're going to hand it over to Jessica. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about upcoming training?
Yeah, so as Pete alluded to, the reef position is in the PMS 310-1. That means you'll be able to find it on the NWCG webpage. However, the PMS 310-1 for this year has not been officially published yet. Usually that happens around late January, early February. So everywhere that you'll see the reef position on the NWCG page, it'll still say draft on it. And then M280 will be the official resource advisor for the Fireline course. And that will be on the Wildland Fire Learning Portal. And we'll have a topic next month discussing M280 a little bit more. And then there is a lead resource advisor course, AKA the REC course. It's offered in Boise, Idaho from April 20th through the 24th. And the nomination deadline will be March 6th, 2026. And I'll put a link into the chat on how you can add your name to that nomination list. And then just FYI for everyone, if you put your questions in the chat for the retardant discussions, I'll be monitoring that and copying that into a Word document so we can track those and ask those to the panelists at the end. Thank you.
All right, great. So for our retardant discussion, we're going to start off with the basics with Hunter Jones, who's a chemist with the Forest Service. Then we're going to follow that up with an aquatics discussion by Chad Mellison, who is a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist. And then we're going to follow that up with a cultural resource discussion from Evan OSKIERKO-JEZNACKI and Rachel Adler from Vanishing Treasures. So I'm going to kick it off over to you, Hunter, if you want to start to drive, go for it. And if you guys, again, if you could save your questions for the end, make sure you're on mute. And you can put questions in the chat, and Jessica will try to monitor those and table them for the end. Thanks, you guys.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Hunter Jones. I work here in Missoula, Montana as part of the National Technology and Development Program. Specifically, our program is the Wildland Fire Chemicals that does all the qualification testing. So I'm very familiar with working with the chemicals. We'll go into kind of an overview of each of the different types, kind of what you expect of use. A lot of this stuff is something that we deliver in one format or another to new pilots and also the air attacks and anybody who is kind of working the fire and observing it from the air. So a lot of these trainings, in fact, a couple of my colleagues just went off and did some presentations at NAFA where they do a similar presentation to this every year and really get comprehensive about it so that everybody understands what they're working with and the limitations of use. I'll do my best to kind of address a lot of the questions at the end, but hopefully I can get to a lot of them just throughout this presentation. So in general, and again, this is just an overview of the retardants and all the different chemicals. What we're doing is we're using them to reduce fire intensity, increase safety for firefighters on the fire line, and essentially we're modifying water in one format or another to make it more effective on the fuels. So each of the products does a different version of that modification and can be a better tool given certain scenarios. And we try to inform, again, the pilots and the air attacks for, which ones are used kind of more appropriately in which scenarios. But before we even get out into using them in the wildland, it has to go through a qualification process. And this is largely where our program is involved in specification testing for the qualification of these chemicals. So they have to meet a wide variety of tests. Most qualifications take about 18 months of time for them to get all the way through. And what we're looking at is anything from the actual effectiveness of the product. So, actually how much does it suppress or reduce fire or flame spread the stability of the product. We want to know if it's going to be, something that can sit at these air tanker bases for, multiple seasons and still be kind of have a long enough shelf life for it to be used up in the right way. So, and outside of that, we do look at toxicity. We run a number of mammalian and aquatic toxicity tests that I'll talk a little bit later on in this presentation in more detail about. But all of that is to meet kind of a minimum standard to even be applied out in the landscape. So those toxicity studies then inform human health and environmental risk assessments, and ultimately the environmental consultation that had to happen on a lot of the retardant products back due to some legal challenges in the early 2000s. So, and lastly, we look at corrosion. That's more, specific to the aircraft and the other type of tanks and different systems moving the retardant. And we want to make sure that it's not going to erode or corrode those kinds of assets in the field. So, again, it's a pretty rigorous testing process. A pretty low percentage of products that we actually test will get on the QPL, and that's just due to how stringent the standards are for health and human safety, as well as effectiveness, corrosion, all the stuff we just talked about. And ultimately, just being safe for the environment, which is, kind of why we're all gathered here today. There are 3 different types of chemicals. The most common or the most widely used is the retardants, which seems to be the focus of this call. But we do have also the foams and the water enhancers that are used in different scenarios. So long-term retardants, we'll go into kind of in the details, but in general, the foams and water enhancers are ideally used in a direct attack or, directly on the flames kind of scenario, where retardants are one of the only tools we have where you can put it out in front of the fire and then have it kind of work up into that chemical line. So the kind of overall use of long-term retardant, again, you can use it in direct attack or, half in, half out, or that kind of thing. But it is, like I said, the only tool that has a chemical reaction that still works when the water has evaporated. And so that's why it's really the only tool for the indirect attack. The foams and the gels, to some extent, are maybe used in out in front of the flame a little bit, but it really is meant to be more of like a water drop to really knock down the flame heights and the intensity in that interaction right at the fire line. So they mainly contain fertilizer salts. So when you think of that, we're talking about an ammonium component and a phosphate. So those two work as that salt, and that is what makes up most of the actual effective ingredient of the mixture. So 85% of pretty much 80 to 85% is the water that is just used to mix these things and transport them. And that's the characteristic. Water is what we're using to get the product to the fire. The retarding salts, again, we talked about phosphate-based fertilizer. That's what is actually going to change the chemical reaction and slow combustion. I have a very nerdy slide next that goes into the chemical reactions, and it's not meant to be memorized by any means, but just one of those things that I think is a fun feature to point out. And then there is, a small amount of it, around 5%, that make up all the minor ingredients. So these products have a thickener so that they are going to, hold together when they're falling out of the aircraft and have be better at hitting your, target area. Then they're also going to have a colorant so that they're visible from the air for air attack and the pilots to know where they actually applied it. And then lastly, they'll have typically some kind of corrosion package in them to make sure that they're not going to cause harm to the aircraft as well. So that's just a general overview of the composition. Probably a little bit more informative of most of the safety data sheets, which in my opinion don't really give you a whole lot of information, but they are the best resource that you have out in the field. We also have product information sheets on our website that are specific to each retardant. So if you ever are working with a certain type of retardant, you can find those on our website, which I'll point out at the end of my presentation. And then here's the nerdery that I talked about. So really all this is meant to show is just kind of the breakdown of these salts when they interact with fire. There's these series of chemical reactions that happen, driving off water, driving off the ammonia, and then it turns it into essentially a phosphoric acid, which then increases charring reactions instead of full combustion. So anytime that happens, you're reducing the amount of heat that's released. As you can see on the equation here, it takes heat to run every subsequent aspect of these equations. So every time you're doing that, you're pulling heat away from the actual fire. So that's why I pointed it out. And I also pointed out so that when you know if I think some of the questions might be oriented around, okay, a retardant drop was applied in some area, we're going to monitor it because it actually never interacted with the fire. This kind of shows what happens when you break it down. And there's really not a whole lot of the component left when there is a fire interaction. So just to be aware of that. Excuse me. And this is just a slide to help show what our annual use has been throughout the last 10 years. So this is, coming on a running average of the last 10 years of around 44 million gallons. This is in the United States. This is what we track from all of our air tanker bases. And this is reported by the air tanker base, each one. So we're only as accurate as the data that we're given, but this has been a pretty good program and has been in place for several decades now as a quality control program. And it does a great job of tracking and making sure that the products are, maintaining their effectiveness and that kind of thing. Another just kind of useful figure to just see where the retardant's being used. Kind of no surprises here, California uses a lot of retardant. And so that kind of gives you the perspective on just overall use in this last year. These numbers obviously change from year to year depending on what's been going on, but this was 2025 and kind of the breakdown by region. So this is our qualified products list. You'll recall at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned how they go through a rigorous testing process. They can't even get on this list unless they have met all of that criteria. Which includes an operational field evaluation. So we test everything in our laboratory, and then once it meets all of those standards, it actually sees a field season of use where we're trying to see, does it actually interact well? Are there any issues? Can it be seen properly? Several decades back, companies were working with different colors and some didn't show up quite as well. So this is the current list, and this is what you would find out available at any for any base or entity to purchase from this list that subscribes to our QPL. So that outside of our federal agencies, that does include other countries such as Canada, Australia. A lot of these other countries use our QPL because they know the type of testing that goes into getting on this list. So just awareness that this is here, and also awareness that there are different types of retardant. So on this list, really there's only a couple of products left. It's this red color right here is the only one that has that old iron oxide color. Everything else that you see with the F after it is a fugitive color. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it might be something for awareness when you see these products out in the field. If it looks like an iron oxide type color, then you do know that it is that old kind of permanent red, whereas these other newer products do not have that component and should fade with proper sun exposure. And then here's our website, just kind of a quick little view of it. I obviously just kind of copied and pasted some things in here just to point out some things, but the main header is, where you can kind of evaluate which section you want to go into. Under the wildland fire chemicals, you can find each of the different product types. And then of course we have our risk assessments that I discussed earlier and the toxicity information. So your fish toxicity, your mammalian toxicity, these are the minimum requirement, again, that it has to meet to be placed on the QPL. And a product, again, won't ever make it to the QPL if they don't meet those standards. And so just awareness that this website is here, these resources are here. They're, they might be a little bit, take a little time to navigate where you're actually finding the links, but most of them, when clicked on, they'll open up the kind of tray of options for you. And if you're looking for any other test results, they're also going to be located on our website. This will be available for you guys after the discussion today. So if you need to kind of click around these links, and if you have any questions after that, certainly be in touch, because that is something that we're here for, is to help you guys in the field. The next part that I'm going to kind of just touch into is just the aerial application of these products, and the reporting if it ever does end up in a buffer area or some kind of when you're around water and that kind of thing. So that does include certain types of cultural sites, things like that, and these are avoidance areas that we really want to keep the chemicals out of, just because we're trying to preserve those areas and keep them as native as possible. But there are scenarios where they do end up in those areas or in the waterways, and we want to make sure that we report on them properly. So that's something that, just bringing awareness to that. And the next slide, I'll actually show one of these avoidance maps. And again, being part of the Forest Service, I'm a little bit more familiar with those resources, but just recognize that with each of your different agencies, they might have different types of reporting requirements. So make sure to follow those to the best of your ability. And so there's buffer zones around waterways, like I mentioned, and a number of guides and things about how to report these things when they do end up in the water. Unfortunately, it does happen. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head about how many per year, but it is something that we want, and we educate the pilots on, and the air attacks. It's it's more important to report it when it happens rather than to not report about it and then find out later. That typically causes more issues. So here's kind of an excerpt from one of the avoidance maps that we've used for a reference. And so some of them will be terrestrial habitats, some of them will be more of the aquatic. And so just making sure that as a resource advisor, whenever there's an active fire in a given area, being aware that these maps are available, and that we should be well aware of kind of what limitations might be needed in certain areas. If ever there's question about what chemicals can be used in certain areas, if you're working in really sensitive areas, I think the simple answer is to not use chemicals, but instead use water. But again, I'm not quite the resource. I'm not a resource advisor like you guys, so certainly defer to your experience on all that kind of decision making. And yeah, so here is how to submit a report, and kind of going through again. This may be Forest Service centric, but recognizing that there are resources out there for you guys to make sure that these are properly reported. What the product was, if known, when did it occur, estimation of, all these different things. And so this is then used by our environmental group to make sure that these things are tracked and properly followed through with, to make sure that, if there are issues observed, and kind of, how to follow up after the fire. So I'm only going to briefly touch on cleaning products, because this is more for residential stuff. This is what we kind of gathered during the last January, I think it was, with all the California fires. We were getting a lot of questions from homeowners and how to remove the products from different surfaces. And so this might not be applicable for certain cultural and other sensitive sites, which some of the other presenters are going to go into more detail on. So just talking about, if possible, as soon as possible, cleaning or removing it so that it doesn't stain the actual surfaces. Sometimes that's not practical because of fire activity, but as soon as is available to clean it off, the sooner the better. Gentle cleaning with mild surfactants or soaps. Again, this is more for kind of residential. Not sure how applicable that is going to be towards some of the other stuff discussed later on. And then, just mild abrasive. As I mentioned earlier, they have this fugitive color package. So you can see on the upper section here, that's a pretty brand new application of this was MVP-FX. It's just one of the powder products. And then what it looked like after a month of pretty much, full sun exposure. So it does fade with that sunlight. It does have that fugitive aspect to it. And then lastly, just, there's more information on our website for a lot of this stuff. Okay, second to last slide, trying to keep this moving along with 20 minutes of my presentation. So this is the one of the recent publications in the last year that looked about into environmental persistence of these products. And the two that were compared here, MVP-FX is the powder product and LC95 is an old red product that the Forest Service actually no longer uses. It's still on the QPL, but I think you will see less and less of it because it's being removed from a lot of the bases. And so there were some good findings in this study. I won't go into too much detail other than to say that the substrate that the products were applied to really did impact how much toxicity, or mortality happened during this study. It's more noticeable with the LC95, where when you had it on duff or gravel, you had a fair amount more mortality when it was exposed to these organic content, high and low organic content soils. So it does bind in some aspect to those soils and helps with it enhances microbial degradation and that kind of thing, so it doesn't harm. And this study, was looking at rainbow trout, which is a pretty sensitive species. Okay, cool. I think I kept it in just under 20. So thank you guys so much for your time. I will pass it along to the next presenter, and I'll be happy to answer any other questions at the end of this.
So Hunter, before we move on to Chad, just so you know, there's a lot of discussion in the chat. And one thing people want to know, if you could drop that link to the website in the chat, that would be great too.
I can do that. Yep.
Cool. All right, Chad, you're up.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm going to be presenting some research. This is not my research. This is stuff that USGS and Forest Service did a few years ago, but I think it's still pretty relevant to this conversation. I took a class from these guys. It was like a 4-day class, and then I asked to get their slides. So that's how I obtained this information. And here we go. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little time on this slide because I have several others that look like this. When you look at toxicity research, it's a little different when you look at these graphs. If you first look at it, you would look at that long-term fire retardant and say, oh, that's more toxic because it's higher. When you look at toxicity research, it's actually the very opposite. So you got to think of how much of a product or a chemical does it take to cause mortality. So if it's higher, that means it's less toxic. And then
interesting.
On the y-axis, when you look at an LC50 concentration, what that stands for is the lethal concentration to kill 50% of your organisms. So it's a very common thing that toxicity researchers use. So if you just look at this particular graph, we're looking at long-term retardants, foams, and then the water enhancers that Hunter was talking about. And then there is a difference between, young fish and a little bit older fish. And this is looking again at rainbow trout. So age definitely has an impact. If you look at the long-term fire retardants, they were pretty similar. And I've always struggled with what does 400 milligrams per liter mean to me? One thing I think about is, everybody's taking Advil or Tylenol, and those are usually like 200 milligrams. And then we all drink water. We have a liter of water bottle, probably at your desk. So kind of think of it that way. It's not a lot to cause mortality. But what you can see here too is the long-term retardants are less toxic than foams. Foam retardant, very little of it is needed to cause very high mortality. So if you take anything away from this and you're on an incident using foam, please keep it out of the water. And then water enhancers are very toxic as well to fish. All right, this one, we still have our LC50 concentrations over there on the Y. And what we're doing here is looking at different species, aquatic species. And again, foam retardants, it doesn't matter what species you're talking about, it will kill aquatic organisms if it enters the water. The long-term retardants, there was definitely a difference between different organisms. And this is pretty common in the toxicity world. So rainbow trout, so all our fish were fairly similar, but then the D magma, that's a Daphnia, that's just a small invertebrate. It took a lot to kill Daphnia. And then the Hyla azteca, that's like a scud, a freshwater shrimp, was highly susceptible to these things. So it does matter on what kind of species you're talking about when it comes to toxicity of these fire retardant products. So this is looking at leopard frog tadpoles. So we switched organisms from fish to amphibians. The three products here are the main thing to look at here is the with YPS and without YPS. So YPS was a chemical used as a corrosion inhibitor back in the day. And it was essentially a ferrocyanide. And if you caught that word cyanide, it worked great as a corrosion inhibitor, but when it was applied and then you had sunlight, that cyanide chemical reaction happened and that cyanide broke free and became free cyanide. This was a big deal 25 years ago when this product was being used. I should make note that it is no longer being used. So that's a good thing. But you can see how toxic it became once sunlight was applied to this chemical. I remember taking the class and they showed a video when they were doing the research. They put these fathead minnows in these beakers with water and they put retardant in it. And they had a little bit of a reaction, but no big deal. And then they literally took it outside and the sunlight hit it and these fish were jumping out of these beakers to get away from it because that's how quickly it happened. That cyanide broke free. So thankfully, that's not being used anymore. But again, you can see UV does affect probably most of these chemicals in some fashion. Same. So this is for rainbow trout. If you notice, the LC50 really dropped. So it became more toxic for rainbow trout with these with the GTSR, the D75R. There, UV doesn't seem to affect that one as much. But again, organisms react to these differently. Hunter talked about weathering. That was a more recent study and more recent products that he showed. So this is some of the older products. But essentially, what you should take away from this is it does matter on what type of substrate it lands on. And it does matter what product you're using, but it does stay toxic once it's applied to the ground. So that's why it applies to us, because there are things that you can do to keep it from getting into water if it's within those 30 or the 300 feet. I did have in my note, I actually went back and looked at my notes from this class and this slide, and they extended this research to 120 days and then tested the toxicity, and it was still toxic after 120 days. So for some of these products. So just know that if it's applied on the ground, our jobs don't end there. It can still cause impacts if it rains, which it will, and gets into waterways. Again, here's the soil one, similar to Hunter's. High organic soils basically broke down these chemicals. Low organic soils did not. Sand did not. So it does matter on what kind of soil you're dealing with and where these retardants land. They will stay toxic. Again, Hunter touched on this a little bit, but if you have a retardant drop and then the fire comes through, say it's really high severity, and it still burns through, it does take away all the toxicity from these fire retardants. So just be aware of that. If you run across this, you generally don't have to worry about the toxicity if it does burn. And one last technical slide here. If you come across a retardant drop that gets into water, fish can detect the chemical and they will avoid it if they can. So this is essentially this dotted line across the middle there. If it's above that, then the fish actually preferred going there, and if it's below that, they avoided it. So you've got different concentrations there on the x-axis. And essentially this takeaway is these fish are trying to avoid the retardant in the water. So how does this help us? So if you had, let's say you had a retardant drop on a tributary that flowed into a lake and you were worried about fish in the lake, fish have every opportunity to avoid that retardant in that lake. They can just kind of swim away from it. Or again, another small tributary flowing into a larger river. If fish have the avenue to escape, they will. On the flip side, with many of the streams that I work with here in Nevada, California, anywhere in the Southwest, a lot of our streams are ephemeral, or the fish hold out in isolated pools until it rains or the next spring. So if you have a retardant drop and it can get into a system like that where you basically have maybe a mile of wetted stream, fish can't avoid that, and so the effects will be much more severe in situations like that. And I just dealt with that on a fire this summer where we had about a half mile of wetted occupied habitat for a listed fish. And so we were having to try and keep the retardant out of that system as the fish had nowhere to go. All right, a few summaries. So long-term fire retardants are considerably less toxic. That does not mean it's not toxic. But just foams and water enhancing agents are just really bad in water. So the places I've seen where firefighters have run into big trouble is like a big pumpkin or a water tender that has the foams in it, and they get released from the fire and they don't want to carry all that weight, and so they dump it somewhere. That could cause a major fish kill if that gets into any waterway. So just make folks aware that if they need to dump it, put it very far away from any water body. UV can significantly increase toxicity, especially the ones that add ferrocyanide. Again, the product does no longer occur, but it still can impact these chemicals. UV just does wonders when it comes to chemistry. Toxicity is likely to persist in treated areas and can be released in rainwater runoff. So again, I'll show you some photos of things that we can do as reads to keep the retardant where it was put and not get mobilized into a waterway. If you are working on a fire in high organic soils, it does decrease chemical persistence of retardants. Combustion appears to remove any toxicity from retardants, and then fish are capable of avoiding exposure if an avenue of escape is available to them. All right, so I was asked to show a couple slides of, if we have a retardant drop, then what? So hopefully you can see my cursor. This was a fire I was on quite a while ago, and the stream is over on the right where the willows are, and it had a listed trout species, Lahontan cutthroat trout, threatened species in it. And this retardant drop did go across the stream. This retardant drop was the chemical that had the ferrocyanide in it, and everything below this retardant drop was killed. So there's nothing you can do once it's in the water, but this was an obvious area here, this pink. We didn't want the retardant to continually be being inputted into the stream because fish were alive above this retardant drop. And, fish were going to be moving down and recolonizing. So we wanted to deal with this. With my cursor here, you can hopefully kind of see a linear feature, and it was an old diversion that was no longer in use. When I walked across that diversion, there was probably a foot deep of retardant in this diversion, and it was an obvious avenue of water and sediment once mobilized would enter the stream. So I knew immediately we needed to deal with this retardant drop. Here you can just see how vast the retardant drop was with this pink. Again, the stream is off to the right. So what we did was, here's that diversion canal you can see moving away from us, and the stream below. We just put, there was probably 10 straw wattles that we put in that little canal. And we came back after the storm and it worked really good. One thing to note with straw wattles or log erosion barriers is once sediment fills behind that, it goes over the top and continues down. So we knew that, so that's why we put so many in there. And it actually worked really well by putting 10, 15 of these wattles back to back to back through there, and it kept the retardant and sediment from mobilizing and moving into the stream. So surrounding, we only put one layer of straw wattles on the rest of the retardant drop because there was no obvious avenue, like a ephemeral drainage or any other diversion ditches where things could concentrate. So we felt confident that just the one straw wattle would work, and it actually did after the storm. Worked quite well. Another thing you can think about, so this particular fire, we had some hill slopes next to it and a lot of these ephemeral drainages coming down. So we knew once it rained, sediment would concentrate here and then get delivered into the stream. So what I'm showing you is what we did for trying to keep sediment in place, but just kind of visualize if there was a retardant drop here, you could do something similar that we tried here. So notice we had a lot of standing trees available to us. So on the flats, we did kind of a lop and scatter with crews. They just cut down a bunch of trees. They had a blast with their saws and just put a bunch of wood down on the flats. Here's another look. This was probably overkill here. But it did work. We made a note, to come back after it rained, and it did stop a lot of this mobilization of sediment. But again, visualize a retardant drop here. You could have done something similar. What worked even better were these ephemeral channels. Same concept, but we just had them cut a bunch of wood and just throw them down in there. And the theory was once sediment started to mobilize in these ephemeral channels, it would pick up a lot of this wood, and it would essentially cause like log jams in these ephemeral drainages. And that's exactly what happened. Here's after the storm, and all that wood really stopped all that sediment from moving. So again, visualize a retardant drop here. We want to keep it out of a stream. This is an obvious avenue for that retardant to get to the stream. This technique worked very well for us. You've probably all seen straw mulch put down on a fire. It looks really pretty when you put it down originally, and then the wind blows and it all blows away. So straw mulch isn't that great in windy areas. What we found worked better are like wood shards, because it has a little more heft to it, a little heavier, and it stays in place a little longer. So again, if you had a retardant drop in this area and you wanted to keep it stay put, you could put down like wood shards over the top of it to keep it in place. So just some thoughts. Things that you can do to keep it from mobilizing and getting into waterways. And that's all I got for you.
Thank you. Mitigation measures are really helpful.
Yep.
Next up, cultural resources. Very important. We're going to hand it over to Evan and Rachel. You guys ready to drive?
Ready as we're going to be, I think.
I think you're going to do great.
Let me see if I share my screen here. Let's go with this one. Is this coming through okay?
I think it's still thinking.
I see it on my end.
Sweet. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Evan OSKIERKO-JEZNACKI, and I'll be presenting alongside my colleague, Rachel Adler. We work in the Vanishing Treasures program here in the Park Service in Santa Fe. Small program, and we deal mostly with preserving and stabilizing like pre-contact structures and historic structures and vernacular structures, a lot of backcountry ruins and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about just building off of a lot of what already has been said, but sort of at the material level for a lot of the cultural resources that you might see on a fire, and some of the anticipated effects and some of the mechanisms so that you can kind of be conversant on what to anticipate if there's an exposure, and with a couple of things towards the end on operationally how you might be able to mitigate some of those things. So this has already been talked, kind of covered in depth, but we'll just kind of talk really quickly about the takeaway is everything that makes a retardant really good at being a retardant is really bad for just about everything else, including cultural resources and materials. And this goes for the three kind of primary types that we already talked about. So you got the long-term retardants, you got your foams, and you got your gels. The big thing here is that there's a lot of water and there's a lot of salt, and it's important to know some basics about these three types, because then that'll give you some information on when to anticipate when they might get used and where, So, if you're on a fire and you start to hear, in ops meetings or during the briefings that, there's certain tactics that might be being employed to try to manage and control the fire, and you're understanding that there's some cultural resources in that area, having some understanding of what they used and in what quantities, how long ago, those types of things. And then you can start to think about what you might anticipate in terms of damage. But the main takeaway really from these three is that from my experience and from a lot of the literature out there, and from just a lot of past evidence, the gels are really bad for cultural resources in general, buildings, archaeology, and that has a lot to do with the fact that it's a lot of the same stuff, but it has a longer linger time. And so it gives there's more of a likelihood that all those chemicals and components of the material or of the retardant will have a better chance of making its way into a material. And the foams sometimes are used in structure protection, but they don't last very long, so they're not super effective in that regard. So if I think one of the biggest things is that reads are really operationally we are a conduit of information, right? We're not really doing a lot of the application. We're not doing a lot of the sort of that level, but making sure that at the operational level, people are informed on the different types of things that might be getting used. And so if somebody's saying, hey, we're gonna we have a backcountry cabin somewhere, log cabin, and we're gonna go pre-treat it with gel, right? It's not really a good idea. There's not a lot of evidence or science or literature that suggests that applying any of these directly to a cultural resource is beneficial in a fire sense. There might be some benefit in terms of mitigating, let's say, like ember storms and things like that, if you've got like a cedar shingle roof or something like that. But generally, the cons are going to significantly outweigh the pros in terms of that. So if you hear, if they're saying, oh, we're going to go pre-treat a structure or Native American wooden structure or something like that, that's a good time to kind of step in and say, it's not really a great idea. And you can explain some of the outcomes and why that may be. And I'll pass it to Rachel. The SDSs were covered, but she'll talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. So first of all, I just want to make it clear that I am not a READ. I've acted as a READ, but not on fires before. And so I'm really going to be focusing on materials and how these chemicals have the potential to affect the materials. I'll also state that I'm an architectural conservator, so my focus generally tends to be on above ground resources, standing architecture, historic structures. I am an archaeologist by training, but it's been a minute since I worked as an archaeologist, and by a minute, I mean like 20 years. So if I am not covering as much about archaeological material as you guys would like, please let me know and I will do my best to remedy that. So then, I think that the number one thing that you need to know when you're dealing with conservation of any material or any cultural resource is you need to know what you're dealing with, right? And so you need to know what kind of retardant was used. You need to know where to find that information. And once you have that information, the people who are using those chemicals should have the SDS documents on them. And that will tell you what they're made of. It's been covered already, but we're talking, I think, around 80% water and a 10% or 85% water, 10% salts, and then 5% other, including colorants. The number one issue with the retardants is water, right? Water is the number one killer of cultural resources, especially resources that are not maintained on a regular basis. The salts are not great or even good, but the salts are only going to be an issue if they have water as the vehicle to carry them into the material. And so, you want to know, if possible, what type of salts you're dealing with. And where the material, aka the water, has gone, because where the water is going, that is where the salts are going to go. So the number one thing to know is, if possible, what type of retardant was used, and then we can move on to the next slide. And the second most important thing to know is what material you are dealing with in terms of treating or mitigating any damage that's done by this retardant. So because of the area of the country that I work in, I primarily deal with stone, masonry, brick. I know, why I don't deal with wood as often, but a lot of the principles are the same in terms of how water moves through them. So I just want to talk briefly about porosity. And generally speaking, the more porous a material, the more vulnerable it's going to be to water infiltration. And the pictures I have here, we'll start with the one on the bottom. It just kind of shows an illustration of what porosity means. Okay, so if you have a stone and you basically have particles. I'll take sandstone just because it's an easy one to describe. You have sand particles. They are held together in a matrix. And any space that matrix does not take up between those sand particles are pores. And where there are pores, that is where water can go. And if you have salt impregnated water, the salt can also go where the water goes. So the photo you see up here on top is actually pores between the particles of a stone, and those are salt crystals that you see. So the water has gotten into those pores and has evaporated and left the salt crystals to solidify. And as I think most of us know, when a liquid, when anything crystallizes, the structure, the molecular structure changes, and it usually expands. So if you have something like this deep inside the material that you're trying to mitigate, you can't see what's going on because the water has carried it inside the material. And B, that those crystals are expanding and exerting. I read this yesterday. It's something like, I don't know, like when ice expands, it exerts 5 to 10 times more pressure than it does when it's liquid water. But when salt expands, it can exert up to 800 times the pressure than the material is used to dealing with. Lower porosity materials have the potential to absorb less water, but they might be breathable, which are less breathable, which means that when the water gets in, it can be trapped, right? And the salts can sit in there for longer, and they can also move farther, deeper into that substrate. And again, the primary issue is not necessarily the salts, but it is the water, because the salts can't go anywhere unless they are carried by water. There is also the issue of permeability, which I'm not really going to cover. It's not super relevant, but that's when you have a lot of pores, but those pores aren't connected. And so the water can get in some, but it can't really travel. So if you're dealing with a material that's porous, but is not necessarily permeable, you might get some issues on the surface, but you have it's much less likely that the problems will be kind of deeply embedded in that surface material. And then in addition to salts, which are coming from the retardants, you also have the freeze-thaw damage, biological growth, wet-dry cycling, and all of that is caused by water that is applied to these materials. So people think retardant and they think chemicals and they think oh no, chemicals are the worst. But I would say that probably the introduction of the sheer amounts of water in retardants is probably a bigger issue to deal with. Okay, I think we can move on to the next one. Okay, so here we have just to talk a little bit about capillarity. This is something that also you have to sometimes deal with when you have low, not super porous material, or if the pores are very small. Probably a lot of you know this, but I'll explain it briefly anyway. Capillarity is basically the ability of kind of narrow channels to pull in water because of the surface tension between the water molecules and the surface of the pore. So the narrower the channel, the deeper or higher the water can go. And so if you have a stone with a lot of capillaries and you have the water and the retardant that has been applied, they can be drawn pretty far into the stone. But it's also important to note that water is drawn up through the foundation of a building through capillary action. And so if you have retardant that is in the ground around the structure, the cultural resource that may be a structure or a foundation or a wall, that retardant and the salts can be drawn up through the ground through capillary action. And it can actually be drawn up depending on the material, like several feet. I don't know if you've ever seen like a building that's in like a stockyard or near a stockyard, and you see like there's usually a line of salt like 2 to 3 feet up because of all the salts in the from the animals and the soil. So that same principle is true of anything really that's in the water or in the soil that's around your building. And then on the top here, you just have an example of what salt crystallization within a material can do. So that's a brick that's essentially been powdered because you have salt that's crystallized inside the pores of that brick. And it's basically just, you know, crumbling and eventually will probably disappear completely. Okay, I think we can move on. And I'll pass it back to Evan for these short-term.
Yeah, so you know, so having some understanding of, you know, operationally, right? You're on a fire. What might be happening where? What resources are in those locations, and then what those resources are made from. You know, what they're built out of or what they were constructed from, and then you can start to build a picture in your head of what the priority is for, you know, where you need to go document or go put some eyes on and see what may have happened. But generally, there's, you know, you're going to have short-term and long-term effects to retardant exposure. The short-term ones I'll cover. You know, they're very basic. It's physical or mechanical, right? So in the next slide, I'll show the video that I'm pretty sure everybody has seen of the VLAT crushing the car with the retardant drop. But you know, again, I'll just reiterate, it makes almost no sense to drop retardant on structures. It's most of the time structures are caught in the crossfire because they're either not well mapped or it's not on, you know, the sort of radar, right, of people who are applying those things. And there are other higher priorities, you know, in order to, you know, control the fire, spread of the fire, that kind of thing. So most of the time things get caught in the crossfire, but it's helpful to reiterate that it really makes no sense to drop directly on structures. It's you know, water weighs like 8.5 something pounds per gallon. In the last you know, presentation you saw, I think that, you know, like the long-term retardant, the like Phos-Chek is almost like an additional pound per gallon. So you're looking at somewhere between 9 and 10 pounds per gallon. You know, VLAT carries whatever, like 9,000 gallons. So, you know, do the math. But so there could be direct and sometimes hidden structural issues related to direct or collateral damage from these drops. The other thing worth noting is, you know, sometimes they'll try to, you know, build a perimeter around a structure, but you got to be careful with hazard trees because those drops can weaken those trees. It could drop those trees onto the structure. It could cause issues in the post-fire sort of context. So those are things to look out for. And then the other thing, you know, is basic stuff like thermal shock, right? At the Dragon Bravo fire, and it was the picture on the cover, you know, there was a lot of spall that was noted around a lot of those structures. And so when you have a structure that's fully involved, or you have an area or a historic district where things have been burning for a long time, or have been exposed to heat, radiant heat for a long time, they don't even need to be on fire themselves, but they could be within that exposure range. And you drop anything, water or with retardant or not, it exposes them to a drastic thermal shock, and you can get cracks, spalling, cracked windows, those types of things. And then the long term, which may not happen for, you know, months, if not years after an exposure, I'll pass it back to Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so some of the longer term effects of the retardant, we've talked about already. Salts, which, these are impacts that you might not see for several months or even years, depending on the environment and the amount of retardant that was like applied to the structures. Again, depending on the amount of water and the environment, these structures might stay wet for a long time, which might be good in terms of fire suppression, but it's not good in terms of the materials themselves. You, again, go through freeze-thaw cycles where the water freezes and expands and then thaws. And if a stone goes through those, multiple cycles in a short period of time, that can break it up pretty effectively. And then the salts in the building, if they remain in the materials, they actually will attract water, and so it will keep the building from drying out, which I realize is kind of the point of the retardant, right? But it is not great for the material, depending on what the material is. Permanent visual impacts. We've all seen the pictures of buildings that have been, covered in the bright red slurries. I know, like, I was in Mesa Verde in the early 2000s, and the slurry that was dropped around Spruce Tree House, like, as far as I know, is kind of still very visible. And that can affect the significance of the site. It can also affect the visitor impact to the site, or the visitor impact, like, how they experience the site. I think, one of the main things you can do there is just interpret, like, why does it look like that? It's because, these fires happened and these were the best ways of dealing with them at the time. And then finally, I'll deal with archaeological and subsurface deposits. So if you have, I'm thinking of things like lithic scatters, ceramic scatters, middens, those are like surface and subsurface deposits. If they are covered or get covered with retardant, my recommendation is that cleaning those individual artifacts is more trouble and more resources than it's worth. The information that you're going to get from those artifacts comes from their context, right? From where on the surface they're located and how deep and at what levels. And so I think it's just going to be a matter of, like, we're going to bite the bullet and deal with the fact that these artifacts are covered in retardant. Maybe it makes them not as attractive. Maybe we can't get as much information, for instance, if it's ceramic, from decoration or from, what kind of materials they're made out of. But leaving them as they are and just coming to terms with the fact that they're covered with retardant, I think is the safest thing for the artifacts, and it's also the most useful thing in terms of getting future information from those objects. But retardant can also change the subsurface chemistry of the soil, and so it's important to note where retardant application has happened, because if you're doing things like looking for, like, biological markers, things like seeds, or like effect or evidence of agriculture that rely on biological and sometimes chemical materials in the soil to collect data, it's going to be really important for future archaeologists to know that the application of retardant is something that they are dealing with in these areas. Okay, I think that's all I got for that.
Okay, I think in the essence of time, I'm going to skip the video. I'm pretty sure everybody's seen the video of the car getting crushed. So I'm just going to skip that. In terms of operational guidance here for READS, in the post-fire world, mitigation of a removal of those retardants is not going to be guaranteed, right? It depends on a lot of factors: the material, the exposure, the linger time in the environment that it was applied in. So don't. The key here really is that the key to mitigation is avoidance, right? So getting your resources early, you know, talking to the park, figuring out where your prioritized resources are, and getting them on the operational retardant avoidance maps is key, and making sure that they stay there. Sometimes they drop off. I saw Jason Nez. We were on Dragon Bravo, and there was a site that we were trying to make sure was on that map, and it would disappear every time an IMT came or transitioned. And so if it's sensitive, we can use buffers and things, but they're not just for, you know, natural resource avoidance. There's, you know, we can use those tools to help protect those resources. A lot of times the retardants are used as contingency lines or action lines, meaning they're established well ahead of time, well ahead of the fire front, well ahead of fire spread, which means you should have some time to be able to go and scout those areas and making sure that that line is not right through a sensitive archaeological site or a undocumented backcountry cabin or something like that. So again, key to mitigation in this sense is avoidance, because what we'll talk about kind of quickly here, it is very difficult to, if not impossible in most cases, to remove this stuff. There are some examples where it's been successful, but those are the exception and not the rule. You have three things working against you. Time. A lot of studies basically show as soon as that water is evaporated, then those chemicals, you know, they can cure, and they sit on the surface, and then they start to sort of get sucked into the material over time, well after the fire, during rain events and things like that. And so that small window, which is usually 2-3 days, depending on, right, you know, a fire, generally it's happening, it's hot, it's windy. So it's those are the worst kind of environments that allow this stuff to dry really fast. So, and obviously it's not going to be safe to go in there and do this kind of work until, you know, the fire is mitigated, there's mop up, all that kind of stuff. The material, right, you know, in the Southwest out here, most of our materials are going to be very porous sandstones, limestones, timber, log. And so those are going to be really susceptible to this kind of damage. And then of course, scale, we'll talk a little bit about that. There are some methods, right? But they're not, these are, think, you know, lab coat and toothbrush type things. These are not something that you're going to apply to a building or a large structure scale. You might be able to do it in small sort of applications, but the cost and timing is going to really work against you there. And then of course, it's important to manage expectations, right? Even if all these things lined up, returning a resource to a pre-fire condition is going to be unlikely. And so, you know, one of the things that you can help do, you know, is manage some of those expectations. And again, emphasize avoidance during the actual suppression activity. In terms of what you could do in the immediate sort of context, the first thing always to keep in your head is to try not to do any more damage. If it's already been hit with retardant, if it's already been burned, or both, just try to keep all the things that we just talked about. You know, you're dumping a ton of water, you're dumping a ton of water with the retardant, the chemicals of the retardant, the mechanical action of the force and all that stuff applied. So the best thing to do sometimes is really just to not do any more damage. If windows have been broken, if roofs have been compromised, don't dump more water onto the structure. But we will say, and this was there was some examples of this being successful, even last fire season, I think at Black Canyon. You know, if you've got non-porous, low porosity materials, if you have the resources available, which is rare, and you can mitigate your runoff, or if it's in an environment where it's not a concern, and you know where the water's coming from, meaning, you know, some of the water in a lot of these places is going to be treated, chemically treated, or may have contaminants. You know, you don't want to introduce more contaminants or different contaminants on top of the ones you already have. And you can ensure that it's applied at low pressure, right? Think like a type 6 with the forestry nozzle. Then it's worth trying in a small area to see, you know, if it's effective in rinsing things off in that very short term. Start low, titrate to effect. And if you have time to reach out to some resources, you know, cultural resource specialist conservators to try to determine based on that material what kind of pressure you might is a good stopping point. But generally those forestry nozzles are, you know, they max out, you know, 100 psi or something. So let's say half that is probably safe. You're really just rinsing, right? This picture here of the guy with the 1.5 inch blasting the stone foundation. totally the wrong approach here, because you're really just the physical nature of the water pressure is going to be driving those chemicals in that water further in. And this can be particularly damaging in swing season fires, right? So if you got a fire in the late fall, early spring, and you dump a bunch of water on a structure like this, you will most likely definitely see damage from freeze thaw pretty immediately. And then in the post fire, you know, if you do have an exposure, right, sort of very similar to on the natural resource side, is document the severity, the scope of the exposure, the type of chemicals that were used, collect that all into a package, and then I'll pass it to Rachel here to talk about some of the local resources that might be able to help with that, and again, in the sort of post-fire context.
Yeah, so if you have like a highly significant resource or a resource that's really important to your park or the land that you're managing, don't be afraid to reach out to a subject matter expert to discuss, the best practices for, removing or mitigating the damage that retardant has done. I want to reiterate what Evan mentioned, I think either the last slide or the slide before that, which is that, returning to a pre-fire condition is pretty much impossible. As a conservator, especially a conservator of things that live outside, the first thing I always tell people is like, I need you to limit your expectations of, what this is never going to look. If it's been damaged, it's never going to look the same as it did before it was damaged. And so there's a list here of just some around the country conservator resources. We are kind of few and far between in the Park Service, but the Vanishing Treasures is here based in the Intermountain region. The National Center for Preservation Technology and Training have a really good program. They have a lab and several conservators on staff who are highly skilled. HASE, the Historic and Architecture, Conservation and Engineering program, which is based out of the Northeast office, again, have a number of very highly skilled conservators. Harper's Ferry Museum Conservation Services, they deal mostly with museum objects, but for example, if you come across a highly significant artifact, a surface deposit or subsurface, they might be people to call. And then the National Capital Region has a number of conservators who just work in that region on the buildings and sculptures and monuments that they're responsible for. So those are all people that you get in touch with. And if you get in touch with one of them, they're all super nice. So if you get in touch with one of them and they're like, oh, that's not what I do, but, we're all kind of in contact with one another and we're aware of each other. So you will likely get help being pointed in the right direction for, who's the best person to talk to. And maybe it's talking to a couple of people at once to help develop the best treatment strategy or the best way to move forward. There's also the READ Resource Library, where there's a link here in the presentation, which has a multitude of resources about retardant, but also about all things READ. And then I think it's really important if you are managing land that has been through a fire and retardant was part of like the mitigation or prevention activity, you want to look at what you have in terms of cultural resources and make a clear list of priority resources, right? So, and you're going to have to define what priority means. Is it structures with the highest level of significance? Is it areas with the highest density of surface and subsurface deposits? Is it, a resource that is really important to visitors? Come up with your priority list on your cultural resources. And then for each one of those resources, come up with a monitoring plan. So that these things have been affected. And what you want to watch out for is not just what they look like immediately after the affecting action, but how things might change over the coming months and years. And you have to remember that these are driven by natural processes, and so we're not talking about something you do for 6 months and then you're done. We're talking about a 5 or 10-year plan to go back to these resources, take photos, have written documentation, have everything together in one place, make sure people know where it is so that if there's turnover, the next person can come in and continue the work. Because it's really important to start with a baseline condition of a resource after it's been affected, and then to follow that resource so that you can see, is it losing material? Is there efflorescence, which is the accumulation of salts on the surface? Does it look different? Is it losing mortar? Are stones eroding faster than they did previously? So I think, especially when you're dealing with an activity or like an effect to a resource that you can't really practically mitigate through direct treatment, monitoring is the most important thing you could do, and it's the thing that you will get the most information from going into the future.
Yep, and that's pretty much our last slide. There's sort of a review slide here, but I think we'll skip that. But just know that, right, you're dealing with water and salt. Both of those are really bad for structures. So know in advance where those structures are, get them on the map, get them in part of the operational conversation to try to avoid it, and emphasize that, avoidance is really the best thing, because once you have an exposure, it's pretty hard to mitigate in the post-fire realm. So if you guys have any questions, I think our emails are somewhere circulated, so feel free to reach out for any of that. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you, guys. Thanks to all the presenters. I feel like this should have been a one-day READ cohort meeting, because I feel like we could keep going on and on, but I think we have some time for some questions. I'm going to ask Pete and Jessica to help make sure that we answer them fairly. Does anybody have any questions that they need addressed while we've got all these experts? I see.
Hey, Jen,
Mara.
this is Pete.
Oh, yeah.
And
go ahead.
I might throw this to Hunter. I know he addressed it in the chat, but for folks who may not have access to the chat, there was a question about PFAS chemicals within retardants, foams, and gels. Hunter, would you maybe repeat or expand?
Yeah, I put some information in the chat. So yeah, PFAS, very good question. There's a lot of different compounds that fall under that category, which are, also get the nickname forever chemicals or, things like that. Those are known to be, so they're fluoride containing compounds, which we don't have in any of our products that we have on the QPL, but they are known to be in aqueous film forming foams. And that's used in certain types of suppression. I included in my comments in the chat about them being somewhat common at hangars at airports, at some military bases. They use it for effectively suppressing a fire where it actually crosses, it floats across oil or water and will suffocate the flames. But we do not test those products as part of the QPL. So we only use Class A foams. And then, like I was saying earlier, the retardants and the gels, they don't have these fluoride containing PFAS molecules in them. PFAS is somewhat everywhere in our environment, unfortunately. It's one of those things that, depending what research you look at, you can find it in things like your pizza boxes that you get, delivery pizza from. So it is somewhat everywhere. How to test for it is pretty challenging. And we have tested a number of our products to make sure that they don't have it. But that's not to say that trace levels don't exist in, some systems. But from the products that we have and that we qualify, they do not have those compounds. So that's about the most thorough answer I think I can provide for you guys.
Thanks, Hunter. Mara, you have a question?
Yeah, I actually put it in the chat. It's more about the reporting. And question being, we have a forest that's got a lot of mixed ownership in between Forest Service land. and we are fighting fires, how do we deal with retardant drops in waterways off forest? Do they have maps to avoid threatened and endangered species? Because sometimes we have those species occurring like really close to Forest Service lands. Not that it's under my purview, I'm just curious.
I will try to answer it. Not really, because this is not, unfortunately, my expertise. If David is still on the call, he might be able to answer some of this from the perspective of different agencies and entities. David Callery, are you possibly still on to be able to answer that? Sorry to put you on the spot. And if not,
I don't see him on. Yeah.
we'll have to get back to you on that one. Unfortunately, I do not know how that works specifically.
So,
Okay,
Hunter, if I could
that-
jump in real quick, I can share with you. So, Brian Lake, Wildland Fire Chemicals Program leader here with Hunter in Missoula. So, a lot of agencies don't have those defined. If you get on
Brian, I think you froze.
Yeah, I think we lost you.
Yeah, I think we lost him. We'll try to we'll try to follow up in one form or another. I think where he was going with it was that some of these agencies might not have some of that stuff outlined, but again, we'll try to follow up and get you the most accurate information when he comes back on.
Okay, and yeah, I mean, some of them aren't agencies. Most of them are private.
I
Right.
think Dave Callery would be a great person to ask. Or I think he would be good.
Yeah, sorry, we can't get you more at this time.
So
I think the other issue, sorry, Jen, is other agencies fighting fire on Forest Service lands and then not reporting what they did. So it's kind of a mix between, you know, property ownership and various agencies. I know California is a special place when it comes to fighting fires, and who's putting what where and who's reporting what. It can be a huge challenge, unfortunately.
So I have a question for Evan and Rachel. Like, I could totally see being on a fire and saying, don't put retardant on these historic structures, and then having somebody coming back saying, well, do you want it to burn or do you want retardant on it? What do you want? So what would be your approach to addressing that?
Well, I would say that it's looking at, I mean, if you look at, it was really just to bring up the evidence, right? I mean, you can look at old fires recently from last year. It was kind of hard to see in our presentation, but one of the slides had a picture again of the North Rim, and it had all of the retardant that was dropped on the North Rim. Some buildings were covered, some buildings weren't, some had treated shingles, some didn't, and it really didn't matter, right? The biggest thing that's going to save a structure is going to be the whole picture, right? Defensible space, making sure you don't have fuels, making sure that you don't have a close proximity to other structures and sort of a conflagration type situation. Generally, everything that I've ever seen, worked on, read, or experienced, if you have a structure that's let's say it's deep in the backwoods and you've got tree line right up to it, maybe it's worth a shot trying water instead of retardant. As far as I can tell, there's really no evidence that supports that retardant actually helps structures, in that scenario, right? Now, if you're talking about setting up a perimeter well in advance, outside of where a structure might be to slow down fire spread up to the building, reduce heat and flame lengths kind of in that 50 to 100 foot range around a structure to reduce your radiant loads and all that kind of stuff, that's definitely worth a shot. And if there's, if you get some collateral damage and spill over onto the building, then, at least you have that argument made there. But doing direct attack is not going to be helpful. I think it was also covered as well that, if it's involved, right, dropping it directly onto it just doesn't work. And you're going to do, being an EMT, everything that always rings in my head is always to say, like, do no more harm, right? If there's already harm that's been done, try to cap it at that and try not to do any more, and document it and move forward. But pretty much everything that I've seen, the cons are going to outweigh the pros, for all the reasons, that we just talked about. You just don't want to, you want to mitigate that as best you can.
Yeah, I could totally hear it. Like I could hear this conversation.
I know. Yeah.
So we're at the top of the hour. Jess and Pete, do you guys have anything else to announce? Follow up?
No, but some of the other questions were, how do each chemicals affect petroglyphs? And how does retardant affect C14 dates? And is there anything that can be done on the ground right away to help flush a stream or a pond? Those are kind of some of the ones that didn't get answered in the chat.
Chad, do you want to address the stream or pond? Like, what do you do if it's on the side of a stream or a side of a pond? Do you just...
Yeah, if it's on the sides, then you do everything you can to keep it from getting into said water body. So I threw out some examples there, but once it's in the water, not a whole lot you can do. So there's some places that do fish rescues. That's usually more from a post-fire rain event type of thing. A lot of sediment's going to come down and kill everything, so they move fish around. That's really hard because you have to have a place to put them, and usually pre-chosen, and that's rare to have that. So once it's in the water, there's not really a whole lot you can do unless you have perfect planning and, we'll just take out our fish and put them over here. That just doesn't happen. So just essentially do everything you can to keep it from getting into the water is my best advice.
Okay. And then Evan and Rachel, like anything for petroglyphs? Is it red retardant on red petroglyphs, or you just...
So, yeah, I can talk about this a little bit. It really, as always, depends. So if we're talking about petroglyphs, we're talking about an image that's been carved into stone. And if we're talking about pictographs, we're talking about something that's pigmented and painted on. And so I would say, especially, again, my experience is, because of where I live, most of the stone out here has sort of a protective coating over top of it that's natural. It's, desert varnish, or it's lichens, or the surface of the material is actually sort of a stronger barrier that's protecting a weaker material, because minerals have been leached out of that material. And so if it's a petroglyph and it's a relatively small area, I would say that might be a good candidate for something like a poultice, where you use either paper or clay, and you stick it to the wall, and you allow the water of the poultice to draw out the salts of the retardant. The salts will crystallize at that interface between the poultice and the rock surface. And then you can just remove the poultice and throw it away. And you just keep doing that until you're getting less and less salts. There's no guarantee that you're going to get everything out of there, and there's no way of knowing that you have gotten everything out of there. But if you get to it soon enough, that might be a good option, because it is like a very defined and hopefully like small area. Because the petroglyph is a break in that crust, it is more vulnerable than the rest of the stone to the impacts of the chemicals in the retardant. When you're dealing with pictographs, my general advice is like, just don't touch it.
Yeah.
Just don't touch it. It's unfortunate that it now has retardant on it, but pigments are so fragile and so easily disturbed that, going back to Evan's recommendation of like, do no more harm, like the harm has been done, and trying to treat that has a high likelihood of causing more harm. So that's how I would deal with those.
Thank you. All right. I think we should call it, Pete. This is a long one. So thanks, you guys. Thanks to our presenters. I know you guys are busy, and thank you all for being resource advisors. Thank you for what you do. You are appreciated. So next meeting is February 18th, right, Pete?
That's right. Deep dive into recent changes with qualifications and training, and we'll hear from a couple members of the Resource Advisor Subcommittee at NWCG. Huge thanks to all the presenters today. Obviously, a hugely popular topic. Obviously, we did not get through it all. Appreciate patience, appreciate sharing of resources, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.